border of Nova Scotia. In 1776, this was part of Nova Scotia. Many people don't know the significance of this fort to the state of Maine and people from New England. In 1776, Jonathan Eddy created what was known as the Eddy's Rebellion, and he recruited men from Machias. And as he sailed this way, the 20 men from Machias recruited more men. And by the time they reached the fort here, they had almost 200 men, and they almost captured the fort. Let's go back in time and look at the story behind Eddy's Rebellion. Very early in the American Revolution, the people of Machias drew a line in the sand and determined that they were going to stand up to tyranny and fight for liberty and freedom. This account is about a group of people from Machias who recruited other people to attempt to put a 14th stripe on the American flag. Some refer to it as the Battle of Fort Cumberland, and others call it Eddy's Rebellion. Jonathan Eddy and men from Machias recruited a militia and attacked a fort in Nova Scotia in the fall of 1776. It may help to set the timeline for this story. 3 years prior to this event, the Boston Tea Party took place in 1773. New Englanders were fed up with paying high taxes on tea and other goods and decided to throw East India tea into the harbor. The next year, merchants in Nova Scotia began meeting to protest East India Tea Company. Nova Scotia was a powder keg that was ready to explode, and the British were well aware of the dangerous situation. Nova Scotia Governor Francis Legg issued a decree outlawing meetings and assemblies of the people held for various purposes contrary to the public good.
From henceforth, all meetings and assemblies of the people held for various purposes contrary to the public good shall not be permitted.
By 1775, many people in Nova Scotia were quite vocal against British authority. In March of 1775, Massachusetts offered to join Nova Scotia in their rebellion, but it was ignored. People reached a boiling point, and the battles of Lexington and Concord occurred in Massachusetts in April of 1775. Nova Scotia ordered all ministers to avoid controversy with inhabitants of different persuasions or from provoking them to disgust and animosity. Patriots barricaded British supply lines in Boston. Within 2 weeks, 20 supply ships from Nova Scotia had broken through the barricade in Boston. Nova Scotia was deemed hostile to the American cause, and privateer ships sailed to Nova Scotia to cut off exports. Rebels in Machias captured the Margaretta in June, and they captured the Diligent and the Tatamagouche in July. On August 25th, Stephen Smith and his men from Machias sailed up to St. John and burned Fort Frederick, captured 4 soldiers and a ship full of livestock and supplies. I'm standing here on the banks of the St. John River, not far from the Reversing Falls, right downtown in the harbor with the shipping area. You can see behind me the port, lots of pavement, parking lots. Back over here, there's business area, apartment buildings. But you can also see behind me this monument. This monument explains that this was the site of Fort Frederick, a fort that was burned by privateers from Machias in 1775. They captured a ship full of livestock and other goods that had been placed on the ship from all the farms that were upriver. Apparently they've bulldozed the earthen berms and things that were left from the fort and made way for roads and parking lots. A lot of this land down behind me was not there in 1775. It's been filled in for the port. They returned to St. John and took as many as 21 loads of goods from the truck house or trading post. British Admiral Graves ordered all privateer ships to be sunk and to destroy every town harboring privateers.
From this day forth, I order that all privateer ships be sunk, and to destroy every town that harbors any privateers.
Falmouth, which is present-day Portland, Maine, was burned down in October of 1775. Mowat gave the town of Falmouth a few hours to surrender all arms and powder and to swear their allegiance to King George. The people of Falmouth refused and fled. Mowat burned 400 buildings in town and destroyed 11 vessels. The British then went to Boothbay, where more homes were burned and cattle were taken. In January of 1776, Patriots and Acadians in Nova Scotia were joining forces in rebellious meetings. Rumors spread that Patriots captured Bunker Hill and Quebec had also fallen to the rebels. Loyalists in Nova Scotia began preparing for the rebels to attack in the spring. They thought that ships frozen in the St. Lawrence would leave Quebec and invade the north shores of Nova Scotia as soon as the ice melted. Rebels began preparing by stealing British supplies and cattle to salt down to feed invading troops. In May of 1776, rebels invaded St. John and went upriver to Margaretville. George Washington sent rebels to the Maliseet, Micmac, and Passamaquoddy tribes. French Acadians also joined the rebels. Washington's troops at Cambridge commandeered buildings at Harvard College during the siege of Boston. Jonathan Eddy was there. Eddy was originally from Massachusetts, but after fighting in the French and Indian War, he settled in Nova Scotia. He knew the attitude of the local people there. Eddy tried to convince Washington to support invading Nova Scotia. Washington allowed him to make his plea to Congress. Congress was busy organizing their own revolution and would not support an immediate invasion, but gave Eddy £250 to support his cause. Eddy was appointed a colonel in the American military. As spring broke the grip of winter, Nova Scotian John Allen was recovering from smallpox, and his 29-year-old wife gave birth to their 5th child. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4, 1776. The British counterattacked Machias on July 6 through the 9th, when the HMS Viper captured 5 fishing ships carrying about 10,000 pounds of fish and shot 1 man in the arm. Machias decided to build Fort Foster on Machias River side of the rim. The Scott brothers created a long earthen berm along the riverbank, and the town built a blockhouse fort with living quarters. This defensive fortification would slow down the next British invasion of Machias. A log boom chain was stretched across the river downstream of the village. John O'Brien retrieved the Margaretta from Middle River and fitted it as a privateer to go after the HMS Viper that was believed to be on its way to Castine. The people of Machias were angry at the British. Jonathan Eddy arrived in Machias from Cambridge. The people of Machias warned Eddy that the British had posted a reward for capturing him dead or alive. The crew on the Margaretta encountered a British warship off Mount Desert Island. They were outgunned and turned back towards Machias. They were chased into Sawyer's Cove, and the ship was burned by the British. Machias had now lost a prized vessel. The men who fled the burning Margaretta had to run through the woods from Moosabec Reach to Machias. In September, the Massachusetts Council granted permission to Eddy to attack Fort Cumberland. He was given 200 weight of powder, 500 weight of musket balls, and 300 flints, along with 20 barrels of pork. He was tasked with recruiting his own men. Eddy assured Massachusetts that they had support from the local Indian tribes, even though he knew the Penobscots and Micmacs had declined to help. The HMS Rainbow sailed from New York to Nova Scotia to meet the HMS Hope. They dropped anchor, and after a couple hours, Sir George Collier went ashore to notify the lieutenant governor that he had been sent to relieve him of his duties as Commodore. James Dawson was the captain of the Hope and had the reputation of being the best privateer hunter in the Royal Fleet. In October of 1776, patriots around Fort Cumberland were upset with George Collier's naval tactics. Eddy and Samuel Rogers had fled to the safety of Machias. Eddy told Massachusetts that he wanted to add a 14th stripe to the American flag by capturing Nova Scotia. The Machias Committee of Safety had 2 leaders taken prisoner by the British, and they were reorganizing when Reverend James Lyon offered to help Eddy recruit men to attack Fort Cumberland. Why did they decide to attack Fort Cumberland? Well, the French had built the fort, and the British had captured it back in 1755. The British pretty much abandoned it until Joseph Gorham arrived in the summer of 1776 to repair the fort. Critical points were that it was a strategic 15-mile strip of land between the top of the Bay of Fundy and the Northumberland Strait. It was also a dividing point between French Acadians and the British. Most locals hated the British and even tried to recruit the British soldiers to defect. Villages all across the region were communicating and encouraging each other to fight back. Reverend Lyon, who was the minister in Machias, had been a minister in Nova Scotia, and he knew many people were rebellious to the crown. Reverend Lyon's words were,
"I highly approve of the noble spirit and resolution of Captain Eddy, and heartily wish him success in all his honor of reducing Nova Scotia."
20 men joined Jonathan Eddy. John Mitchell of Chandler's River, Richard Parsons of Mount Desert, all volunteered. Jabez West and William Albee and Reverend James Lyon offered to recruit more men once they landed in Nova Scotia. Captain Elijah Eyre agreed to sail the men to the St. John River. They left Machias on October 13, 1776. John Allen had left Campobello the same day because he also learned that he was a wanted man. Allen's ship and Eddy's ship passed each other out in the Bay of Fundy, where they recognized each other. Allen quickly warned Eddy that Fort Cumberland was heavily armed and asked him to postpone the attack. Allen said that the Micmac had indicated that they would not support the American rebels. The local tribes were not predictable and fought on whichever side seemed best on any given day. John Allen begged Jonathan Eddy to spend the night at Campobello and wait for a letter from Allen, who was headed to Machias. By the time the letter reached Eddy, he had recruited 9 more men, including Robert Wilson of Campobello Island. Allen's letter advised Eddy to cease and desist attacking the fort. Eddy went anyway. First, they sailed to St. John, where Captain Eyre snuck 30 rebels into the harbor undetected. They sailed past the remains of Fort Frederick on their left. They had burned the fort the previous fall. Eyre navigated his schooner 60 miles upriver to Maugerville, where more rebels were eager to join them. Maliseets also decided to join them. On October 29, Eddy and 72 men arrived at Chebedy just as the sun was setting. Eddy went to Ruth and Abiel Peck's house. Abiel agreed to guide the rebels 5 miles up the coast to the British outpost at Chebedy, where he helped recruit local Indians. Chebedy Outpost was built to stop invaders from Machias from reaching the Fort Cumberland. The outpost was likely located at either Hopewell Cape or Fort Folly Point. Johnny Walker oversaw the outpost. He had become a respected military leader during the French and Indian War. He had been chased out of Massachusetts because he was a loyalist. He was motivated to beat the rebels. Walker was caught off guard and was wounded. One of his men, Solomon King, was killed. Eddy's rebellion had officially begun, and 14 British were taken prisoner. A ship was sailed back to Machias to drop off the prisoners and wounded. The following morning, October 30th, Eddy's men woke excited about their success the night before. Now they had to reach Fort Cumberland before they lost the element of surprise. They knew of Ethan Allen's successful surprise at Fort Ticonderoga. Eddy split his men into 3 teams. One team went with Abiel Peck and the Maliseets to recruit the Micmac tribe. He returned with just 4 Micmac. Eddy took a second team to Memramcook to recruit French Acadians. About 25 Acadians had joined him. Some historians claim Eddy had 400 men at this point, but it was likely less than half that number. A third team went to McCann to block communications and to gather intel on Fort Cumberland. The following day, 2 ships approached Fort Cumberland, the Polly supply ship and the well-armed Juno. The ships were full of winter supplies for the fort. One of the ships was a 32-gun ship named Juno. On November 1, Eddy held a meeting at Sackville, where local patriots told him he would lose if he attacked the fort. Eddy assured them he would win and asked them if they would want to be remembered for doing nothing or for aiding the Americans. They agreed to help. On Saturday, the Juno pulled anchor and began to leave. On Sunday, a small boat left the fort with soldiers who headed for Chebedy Outpost to relieve the post and replenish supplies. When the supply ship reached Chebedy, they found the post was empty. Ruth Peck told the British that a militia from Machias arrived with several Indians. She said that 150 to 200 men were headed to attack Fort Cumberland. The ship Juno came back to the fort on Monday. They anchored next to the supply ship. The fort now knew that locals were helping Jonathan Eddy. The fort sent spies out to local villages to gather information. 2 of these spies were James Dorthwaite and David Dobson. George Collier learned of Eddy's rebellion and believed more men would come from the Kennebec and the Penobscot. On November 6, a private Johnson reported that a man from Westcook, who he had seen in Machias, had offered him a bribe to let 500 patriots into the fort. Johnson said the 500 men were waiting in Westcook and intended to attack that night. The fort had lost about 60 men and only 3 of their 6 cannons were functioning. Eddy seized the local minister's house after hearing he preached against the Americans. The frightened minister ran to the fort for protection. Eddy's men found 40 cord of firewood in West Cook that was to supply the fort. The firewood was thrown into the river. Eddy's men then snuck up to the grounded out supply ship, Polly, at the fort under the cover of darkness. The soldiers on board were asleep, except for the one who alerted the others in time for them to surrender. As the sun rose, it was foggy. A patrol boat was sent out to alert all British soldiers of Eddy's plans. Soldiers were ordered to bring supplies from the ship into the fort. Captain Barron went overland to Halifax in case the patrol ship was captured. One of Eddy's men on the ship Polly was Zebulon Rowe. He heard voices and realized that the British soldiers were headed from the fort out to the supply ship. As the soldiers approached the ship, they were captured and forced on board. 30 men were taken prisoner, including Captain Barron and the minister who ran out of the fort and was reportedly drunk. By 7 a.m., the fort realized something was wrong. Boatloads of rebels began approaching from West Cook. The fort began firing on them. Rowe hoisted the sails on the supply ship as the tide began to float the hull. The supply ship escaped with the rebels on board. The 200 soldiers left in the fort needed food and firewood. Eddy now had about 180 men in his troop. On Friday, November 8, soldiers were making the fort stronger when Private Curry fell to his death while replacing a heavy timber. Some Maliseet Indians captured 2 British soldiers. The supply ship had about 600 barrels of pork and beef, 50 firkins of butter, 1 ton of candles, and 2 hogshead of rum. There were 700 blankets. Eddy set up camp at Camp Hill, and his success drew attention of locals. Eddy had been in the region for 12 days. His recruitment efforts were very successful. The mobility, speed, and guerrilla warfare tactics of his men made them very confident. By this point, he had captured Shebedi Outpost, the supply ship, and 62 fencibles from the fort. The term fencibles is from the word defensible and used to describe temporary British army raised mostly from local volunteers to defend the fort. Joseph Gorham was in charge of Fort Cumberland. He had fought in the French and Indian War and had trained with Robert Rogers Rangers and later created Gorham's Rangers. He knew military tactics and strategies. On November 10, Eddy sent a message to the fort and asked Joseph Gorham to surrender. Gorham responded by saying that he would gladly accept Eddy's surrender. This was discouraging and infuriating to Eddy. On November 13, at about 4 a.m., Eddy and his men attacked Fort Cumberland under the cover of darkness. The Acadians created a diversionary attack while a second wave of men followed with ladders and tools. A third wave made a furious assault on the quarters from another angle. A Maliseet Indian snuck over the outer wall and ran up the hill to the interior fort. He scaled the inner wall and went inside the fort to unlock the fort's entrance. Once inside, and just as his hand reached the bar locking the door, a fencible struck him with a sword and maimed him. The fort was too prepared, and Eddy realized it would not be captured this day. Eddy's 22-year-old son, Isbrook Eddy, rushed the fort and observed large piles of logs ready to be released to roll on top of the approaching rebels. As Eddy's men fired on the fort fired back. Eddy's men later recalled cannonballs whistling past their heads. Eddy ordered his men to retreat, and he later wrote,
We thought fit to relinquish our design after a heavy firing from their great guns and small arms without intermission for 2 hours, which we sustained without any loss, except an Indian being wounded, who behaved very gallantly and retreated in good order back to our camp.
The fort kept sending messengers out to get word to Halifax that they needed support, but they all failed. Word began to spread locally. A man named Michael Franklin, who was the previous lieutenant governor of Nova Scotia, was patrolling the bay looking for privateers when he encountered a ferry barge.
On the morning of the 9th of November, I was patrolling the Bay of Fundy for privateers when I recovered a ferry that had been taken and learned from the passengers that Jonathan Eddy was active at Fort Cumberland. Thomas Dixon then ensured word reached Halifax to send reinforcements.
The men on the ferry alerted him about Eddy's rebellion. Another man named Thomas Dixon learned of the invasion. Those men made sure word reached Halifax so more troops could come to the fort. Eddy sent word to Boston that reinforcements were needed. As word reached Boston, it was learned that General Howe had retreated in New York. Troops would be sent to New York and not to Nova Scotia. Eddy and his men were on their own. John Allen, who had discouraged Eddy from attacking, had gone to meet with John Adams, who supported attacking Nova Scotia. Adams arranged for Allen to speak before Congress. The men from Machias, who were with Eddy, felt it was a wise time to return to Machias. They had not planned on such a lengthy enlistment. The local committee of safety wanted the men to stay and fight. They offered each man 8 pounds a month and a suit of clothes for each man who stayed. The men knew that they needed cannons to be successful to take the fort. They talked of sailing to Charlottetown to retrieve cannons that they had seen left on the beach. Sir George Collier learned of Eddy's rebellion and ordered his naval fleet to respond to Fort Cumberland. The HMS Hope, the HMS Rainbow were organized as a defense and set out to find the HMS Diligent and the HMS Albany to send them to the fort. Up to this point, Eddy had cut off all supplies to the fort. By November 21, the fort was worried. 4 soldiers, including Private Benjamin Andrews, had deserted in the past week. Starving the fort was slow. Waiting was difficult. Eddy's men wanted to engage and end the battle. Winter began setting in. Soldiers in the fort were wearing rags and old blankets to stay warm. Soldiers were being given rum night and day to fight off the feeling of being cold. On November 22nd, at about 3 a.m., Eddy's men lit the fort on fire. Chaos broke out inside the fort. Eddy's men began firing on the fort. A bucket brigade inside the fort slowly put out the fires. Eddy should have launched a full assault on the fort, but he did not. On Tuesday, November 26, Eddy had his men go door to door to collect known debts from loyalists. Edward Barron was inside Fort Cumberland, but his wife Anne was home, where Eddy's men found 30 beaver hats, 2 guns, 200 flints, 40 pounds of powder, and some snowshoes. 7 of his sheep were rounded up, and some East India rum. By the last week of November, Eddy was realizing his tactics were not working. Winter was setting in on the northern tip of the Bay of Fundy. Bluffing, burning, and attacking the fort had all failed. Eddy knew more British must be on the way to the fort. Eddy could not allow any supplies to reach the fort. On November 27, a heavy fog covered the fort. Fencibles inside the fort made a brave move of opening the fort to let some cattle out to graze. Eddy's men had been waiting in a ditch and behind some stacks of hay, and quickly began to herd the cattle towards the woods. The fort fired upon the men, killing several and wounding 3. One of the wounded died later that day. At about 10 o'clock, the HMS Vulture was seen entering the bay. 2 boats rowed to the fort and learned the British still held it. A cannon was fired 3 times to alert the remaining crew that the British held the fort. The Machias Committee of Safety was upset that Massachusetts was still debating taking Nova Scotia. John Allen was offered the role of Indian agent for the entire region. This distracted him from supporting Eddy at Fort Cumberland. Reverend James Lyon of Machias offered to do more recruiting to help Eddy. He stepped down from the pulpit to enlist full-time. He was heard to say,
I recall being requested to send them all the assistance in our power. 49 of us immediately set out in boats as reinforcements.
On November 27, the HMS Vulture arrives with British Marines and Fencibles. British troops began going house to house, burning houses of anyone who had aided Eddy's rebellion. At least 12 houses and barns were burned. One of those houses was John Allen's house. He was still in Boston, but his wife Mary and 5 children were in Nova Scotia. Congress was still in session, and John Hancock helped gain support for, as he put it, the glory of attacking Nova Scotia. Had Eddy gained support before attacking, his men would have had cannons and other resources needed to add a 14th stripe to the American flag. The British reinforcements went on the offensive and forced Eddy's men to retreat. They went to the St. John River to rest at the Maliseet village of Ocpake before moving on to Machias. This journey lasted about 2 months. One man wrote,
By paths over ponds of glare ice, snow knee-deep, we crossed over a river on floating ice cakes at night, suffering body and mind all the time.
Joseph Gorham allowed 100 local rebels to turn in their arms and swear allegiance to the king. Many said he was too lenient on the rebels. John Allen was appointed the role as Indian agent and granted permission to recruit Indians from the northeastern tribes. He was authorized to place up to 3,000 on the payrolls. He left Boston on January 4 and headed to Machias with plans of his own of attacking Nova Scotia. John Allen met with Eddy in Machias on January 6 and learned of the defeat at Fort Cumberland. He also learned that his house and barn were burned by British troops. Allen was now motivated to seek revenge on Nova Scotia. Allen planned an attack in 1777, but Collier attacked Machias in August of 1777. Eddy successfully organized locals in 43 Passamaquoddy to force the British to retreat. Jonathan Eddy almost beat the odds at Fort Cumberland. He had built an impressive militia. His men spoke different languages, French, English, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet. Yet they worked together and nearly captured the fort under harsh winter conditions. We've been able to verify about 11 names of the 20 men recruited by Jonathan Eddy when he was in Machias. Some of those names are John Albee, William Albee, James Avery, Nathaniel Crediford, James Gooch, Nathaniel Longfellow, William Mills, John Mitchell, who was from Chandler River, which is present-day Jonesboro, Richard Parsons, who was in Machias but lived in MDI, Daniel Stone, and Jabez West. Those are 11 of the 20 men that joined Eddy's rebellion in Machias and came to Fort Cumberland to fight, to try to add a 14th stripe to the American flag. This plaque is a memorial to Eddy's rebellion in 1776. When he recruited men from Machias, he sailed up through the Bay of Fundy recruiting men all along the way. When he reached the fort, he had nearly 200 men, and they all